Welcome to the short version course of Messianic Jewish Theology. I'm so glad you're here with us today. I'm Daniel Juster. I'm from Restoration from Zion of Tikkun Global, and I want to encourage you to get a hold of our textbook, Jewish Roots, Understanding Your Jewish Faith, which used to be called Foundations of Biblical Theology. And then the book, The Irrevocable Calling, which is a really important little short book on why Jews are called to live and identify as Jews in the New Covenant when they believe in Yeshua. And then Passion for Israel, about the importance of the reestablishment of Israel today and commitment to that. I want to begin today by just talking about some key themes. And I'm just going to give kind of like a little outline introduction in a short way. The first thing I want to say about Messianic Jewish theology is our approach. Most Messianic Jews are in agreement with the approach of those scholars like Walter Kaiser, who believe that you have to approach biblical theology by first understanding the teaching of the Hebrew Scriptures in its content. You don't first go in its content and context. You don't first go to the New Covenant Scriptures, think you understand it, come up with a certain teaching pattern that you see as New Testament theology, and then understand the Hebrew Scriptures through it and filter it. There's a dynamic tension between the New Covenant Scriptures and the Hebrew Scriptures, but foundationally, the Scriptures that come first have to be the orientation from which all that comes later is tested. So anything that comes later that is inconsistent with the revelation that is originally laid down in the Hebrew Scriptures cannot be true, or if that interpretation is incoherent with the theology that was already laid down in the Hebrew Scripture, then it's got to be wrong. So we believe that you progressively interpret the Bible in context, in the chronological order in which the revelation was given, and you build up your understanding of theology thereby, and that once you've built up your theology thereby and you come up with a coherent theology of the Hebrew Scriptures, that provides the foundation for understanding the New Covenant Scriptures. And the New Covenant Scriptures are understood in a way that it never undercuts or does away with the clear texts that are foundationally established already in the Hebrew Bible. So that's first of all. Secondly, there are certain themes in terms of Messianic Jewish understanding that are very important. Messianic Jews believe that the Abrahamic covenant is made with the national, ethnic people of Israel, and that is a continuing covenant forever, and promises that the Jewish people forever until the ultimate fulfillment are chosen as a nation and will be an instrument of bringing the nations back to the knowledge of God and bringing blessing to all the nations. We also believe that the Mosaic covenant is a covenant of grace, not a covenant of works righteousness, and that the Mosaic covenant is a glorious foundational revelation of God. Some of us believe that the New Covenant supersedes the Mosaic covenant, that we're now in the New Covenant, but the New Covenant assumes applying everything taught in Moses that is fitting to the New Covenant order. It's the reapplication of the Mosaic teaching in the New Covenant, which promises the preservation of Israel and the ultimate destiny of Israel. Messianic Jews believe that Jews who come to faith in Yeshua are called to continue to identify and live as Jews, and that Gentiles who are one with us in the Messiah do not have the same covenantal responsibility for Jewish life. These are foundational principles by which we live and by what we see. We also believe the restoration of Israel to the land is a key fulfillment of prophecy that is happening today. And finally, we believe in the relationship of law and grace, whereby we're saved totally by grace through faith, but the work of God in our hearts is such that He brings us into obedience to the Torah, so that those who live by grace can be said to be a Torah-obedient people, either by the universal dimensions of the law, which we all have to share, as taught in the Sermon on the Mount, or by Jewish people living according to both the universal and the Jewish specifics of covenant responsibility to live in a Jewish pattern of life. And now I've just summarized all of Messianic Jewish theology to you, and we could think that we don't even have to look at the rest of the clips that we're going to be doing now at 15 minutes at a time, but that's the summary. And I hope that that summary is helpful to you. I'm going to pretty much follow that summary in these clips and hope that you enjoy them and that you enjoy thinking along with me. I certainly enjoy repeating these themes and sharing what I know about them. In Genesis chapter 12, we read of the beginning of the Jewish nation, or the Israelite people. For God says to Abraham, "Get out from your land and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your nation great so that you may be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse you, those who curse you, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So Abraham went and traveled to the land of Canaan, the promised land. It's very important that we understand this text, because this text is the foundational text of texts for Messianic Jewish theology. First of all, that God chose Abraham to be the father of a nation, and that nation is called to bring blessing to all the nations of the earth. And the implication of that is that the Jewish nation that comes forth from Abraham will be the instrument of the restoration of the nations to right relationship with God. That's the foundation, and that never changes. It's an unconditional covenant, and that we are living in the Abrahamic covenant today still. There are a few other things to say about that covenant. Abraham was chosen from a people that still maintained the knowledge of God and didn't become so corrupt that they had lost all sense of the truth. This is why Abraham and his children seek to get wives from their relatives back from where they came, because they had not lost all the knowledge of God. And we read in chapter 11 that Terah, Abraham's father, was already on the way to the promised land and was being pulled to leave and to go to the promised land and to have a new start. And he did not get all the way there, but settled on the way. And Abraham really was continuing the journey of his father. So God could call Abraham because Abraham could hear. He wasn't so far in darkness that he wouldn't be able to receive God's revelation. So now we read about Abraham and his descendants. We read about the incredible reaffirmation of this covenant, not only that Abraham is going to be used this way to bless all nations, but also that Abraham has an everlasting promise to inherit the land of Canaan. So in Genesis chapter 22, when we read about the great sacrifice of Isaac, which of course Messianic Jews take to be a foreshadowing of the sacrifice of Yeshua, we read, "The angel of God," verse 15, "called to Abraham a second time and said, 'By myself I swear, it is a declaration of Adonai, because you have done this thing and you had not withhold your son, your only son, I will richly bless you and bountifully multiply your seed like the stars of heaven and like the sand on the seashore, and your seed will possess the gates of his enemies, and in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed, because you obeyed my voice.'" So now the promise becomes intensified in its reaffirmation, because Abraham lived out in obedience to God's call to sacrifice his son. And that's why in Psalm 105 we read that the promise is forever, for 1,000 generations, where God says, "To you I give your seed the land of Canaan as your portion for an inheritance. Well, we read the amazing story of Abraham's children, the patriarchs, Isaac, Jacob, the story of the birth of Isaac by miraculous intervention of God. We read about Jacob going back to Laban to escape to escape Esau rather. He goes to Laban's house and works for his wives. 21 years he's away. He comes back and has his children, and the struggle with Joseph and the other patriarchal children is such that Joseph is sold into slavery, and that this now is going to fulfill the prophecy that Abraham's seed is going to go down into Egypt and they're going to be enslaved. And now we ask the question, why is it that the children of Israel are enslaved in Egypt? And we understand that there are two reasons given. Number one, so that when Israel comes out of the land of Egypt to possess the land of Canaan, the people they will dispossess will deserve to have lost it because their iniquity will be full, so Israel can rightly and justly conquer that land and be an instrument of God's judgment. But the other reason is that the Exodus is a mighty act of God that is so astonishing and so miraculous that Israel will forever know that before she did any works, that God's rescue, God's taking them out, and God's bringing them into the promised land was an act of gracious salvation, not on the basis of any works, and an act that shows that God identifies with the dispossessed, the marginalized, the enslaved, slavery, the ultimate manifestation of inhumanity to man, and that that's where God's heart is, so that Israel will be an example of God's heart for the weakest and the most poor among the peoples of the earth, which is repeated again and again throughout the prophets and the Psalms, that this is where God's heart is. So God now, through an act of extraordinary grace, takes Israel out of Egypt and brings them to Mount Sinai. And in the next clip, we're going to continue to speak about God's covenant with Israel on Mount Sinai, and then repeated before they enter the promised land in the book of Deuteronomy.